Good evening, students. Today we will be discussing the Monroe Doctrine. If you would please record the following three terms in your vocabulary section, define them, and for each one, explain how each showed the strength of the United States. The words are Seminole War, the Adams-Onis Treaty, and the Monroe Doctrine. Thank you very much. This evening we will be discussing the United States' development as an international power and how it relates to the Monroe Doctrine. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, how did the United States become powerful? Well, in the wake of the War of 1812, America was able to remove the British influence from the majority of the continent. They still had Canada. However, the United States and England officially came to an agreement along the Canadian border where there would no longer be any dispute over what was British territory and what was American territory. On top of this, many European powers were being removed by indigenous forces in the Americas and essentially losing their American colonies and relinquishing control in the Western Hemisphere. Now, the first show of force against a foreign power was the First Seminole War, starting in 1817. This begins with the Seminole tribe out of Florida and Spain's inability to control the Native Americans in its territory. Now, the Seminole tribes were a magnet for slaves that escaped from southern states. By escaping to Florida, they were out of American jurisdiction and therefore were not in danger of being brought home to their plantations. Now, Indians and escaped slaves would go north over the border into Georgia, raid southern settlements, and then they would escape back into Spanish territory, which was sovereign, and most people would not enter. Most people are not Andrew Jackson, however. Andrew Jackson pursued the Native Americans south into Florida, and while he was there, he captured 2 Spanish forts and hung British privateers. Although this was against his orders at the time and he had no power to do so, he declared to the Spanish government that they either control their territory and control the Native Americans living in the territory, or B, relinquish it to the United States so the United States could do it for them. Weirdly enough, they decided that it was better to give Florida up to the United States because it was part of the continent than to have to deal with it anymore, and the United States would be able to get Florida because of Andrew Jackson's rash actions. The Adams-Onis Treaty made the transfer of Florida to the United States official. The United States would obtain Florida for $5 million, and they would create a well-defined border between Spanish-held Southwest and the Louisiana Territory. This was done by Spain, basically in order to protect their interests in Mexico. As you can see by looking at this map, that with the Adams-Onis Treaty, the United States now claimed the entire east coast of the United States, the modern-day United States, and the entire Gulf Coast up to the bottom of Louisiana. And it also made the boundaries between the Spanish possessions of Alta California and Mexico, or New Spain as it was called then, more concrete, and so there would be no territorial disputes. Now you might ask the question, how could Spain, one of the largest and most powerful empires in the entire world, be bullied into giving up one of their possessions by somebody with no real authority? And the answer to that is because the jewel of the Spanish Empire, New Spain, or modern-day Mexico, was in the midst of an independence movement. And in fact, between 1799 and 1830, many major countries in the Americas would seek their independence from the Spanish government. So the Spanish government and the Spanish Empire was quickly crumbling. Now, as each of these countries began to liberate themselves from their colonial overlords, the United States decided to pledge its support to the newly freed nations and declare that they would, in fact, protect these nations. This is referred to as the Monroe Doctrine, signed by James Monroe in 1823. The Monroe Doctrine would state that the U.S. will not interfere in European affairs, but will not allow Europe to interfere anywhere within the Americas. So if any of these countries sought independence, they would be granted it, and European countries would not interfere unless they wanted to deal with us. Well, the question here is, how is this a show of strength by the United States? Well, as represented in the following political cartoons, it essentially said that the United States and South America and Central America were off hands to anybody from the Eastern Hemisphere, or they would have to deal with us. It noted that the Americas were relatively at peace, while Europe was almost constantly at war with itself, and that we did not want that sort of influence in the Western Hemisphere, and the United States would protect us and keep us isolated with the military if needed. Although we may not have been as strong militarily, even as these European powers were, we still had two things on our side. One was our distance, that we were naturally isolated from the rest of the Western world, and two, the fact that trade could in fact be more powerful and more lucrative than actually owning a place as a colony. If you didn't own it as a colony, that meant you did not have to govern it. You could simply reap the benefits through trade. So most European countries went along with the Monroe Doctrine, establishing the United States as a true international power. Under your vocabulary, I would like you to answer the following two questions. So number one, how does the Monroe Doctrine differ from the Washington policy of isolationism, or is it the natural progression of isolationism? And secondly, how does both the Adams-Onis Treaty and the Monroe Doctrine show the strength of the United States as an international power? Thank you very much, and we will discuss this tomorrow.